This is a presentation about the keyboard concertos in the 18th century and how to approach them in a historically informed way. So I would want to go through some of the keyboard concerto that is within the standard repertoire of modern concert pianists right now. You will see there are a lot of familiar names like J.S. Bach, like with his seven, let's say, harpsichord concertos that play on the piano. We have 23 concertos by Mozart, and then 5 by Beethoven. And then, of course, there are Chopin, Schumann, Grieg, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, you name it, a lot of them. When it comes to Mozart, there's one particular problem that you see in some of the editions that you can find online. For example, these are 2 editions on the same concerto in D minor. You will see that the one on the left, the pianoforte part has some notes written in the left hand. And then the version on the right, the pianoforte, nothing is written in there. So the question when I see this was to play or not to play. and how do we know what to play and why is it there? Why are there some discrepancies in some of the editions so those are the first questions that comes to my mind. And generally, in the performance practice way, when you play a concerto, then there are 2 parts like solo and tutti, right? So the soloist will always play in the solo, and the orchestra plays in the tutti, where the soloist rests. And this highlights the contrast between the solo and the tutti, and that's the aesthetic of the concerto genre. And that applies to almost all the instruments, like whether you play string or woodwinds or brass instrument in a concerto, you would always play in the solo part and you would rest in the tutti part. And this was conventional around the 1830s, but what happens before that? So this is a quote by Carl Czerny from his book, The School of Practical Composition, Opus 600. He wrote about more than 1,000 words, and it was translated to English in 1846. He says that the pianoforte, however, has not only the principal part, but it must also, to a certain extent, be independent. And orchestra only enters as a combined mass in the tutti, where the pianist rests. He specified that. But in an earlier work, pianoforte is written for pianists. Also translated to English in London, 1839. He said, during the tutti of a concerto, the player should at most only touch the instrument softly along with orchestra at the fortissimo passages, or what is still better, he should abstain from playing at all. So this gives you an idea. There was some kind of playing element before this. So where did it come from? Like, how did it all begin? So in order to answer that question, I would want to go back to J.S. Bach. This is his Brandenburg Concerto number 5 in D major. Could be considered the first soloistic keyboard part written out like this. You see that in the beginning he wrote accompaniment in the keyboard part, and there are figures in there which means that you should play figure bass as accompaniment here, and then only in here he wrote out all the solo part for the keyboardist to play. Normally, when you look at this, and even in modern rendition of this performance, whether you play it on harpsichord or you play it on the piano, you would always play some kind of figure-based accompaniment, whether realized written out in this part where he writes accompagnato, and then after that you play the solo part as written, right? So after that we move on to one of his son's piece, Philipp Emanuel Bach. This is his keyboard concerto in E flat major, and this is a copy from a holographic manuscript, 1759. Now, the piano part, the keyboard part is here. You see cembalo obbligato. He just wrote the tempo indication allegro ma non troppo. Nothing else written there, but the same can be seen for some other instrument parts. And if you see that there's this small sign here. It's a way of shorthand notation, and it it does not only appear here, it also appears up there. In the viola part, you will see the shorthand notation, and then it says col basso. So col basso means with the bass. And on the second violin part, you see also that shorthand notation for 1 bar, which specifies that play together with the first violin. The viola plays whatever the bass has, and the keyboard part plays exactly with the bass, and there are figures written here. So it's a way for the composer to write shorthand notation because this is their manuscript, and it's not for publication. And they need to write it as soon and as fast as possible. And this is something that they understand. And now when we look back at this composition, because they were not published, or they only exist in holographic manuscript, we are looking into the composer's mind. So, and then we go on to another piece by another sons of Bach, Johann Christian Bach, written a little bit later, and this one was actually published in London. Now this is the solo keyboard part of his fourth concerto, Opus 13. You will see that the solo keyboard part has all the notes written here. And then only here, you will see that there's the word solo here. So what happens before that? Do we play all of that, or do we not play all of that? Well, there are also figure bass written there. And right here, there's a TS, which means tasto solo. Tasto solo means that you only play one note, and you are not going to realize the bass. So all of this information, they are very specific to a performance, to a performance on the keyboard. And so I think, again, we don't really know if you should play them or you should not play them, because performance practice is something that everybody at that time used to know what was going on, and then they just do it. A good example of performance practice nowadays for modern pianists would be Frédéric Chopin, where you see every note that Chopin written there, but everybody tells you that, okay, you should play rubato on your right hand, and then you should keep your left hand as strict as possible. So those information were transferred from Chopin's student to their students, and then it made its way to the 21st century. So even though Chopin didn't write any indication that you should play rubato here or not, but playing rubato became like a staple of Chopin performance. So that's an example of a performance practice in the 21st century that has its roots back in the 19th century. Now, the next one is a concerto in D major by Joseph Haydn, written around 1784-83. So these were closer to the time that Haydn met Mozart and the time when Mozart wrote his his piano concertos. Now, the upper version is the one that was published in France, and the lower version was the one that was published in Amsterdam. On the upper version, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bars. Everything was written out. And on the 7th bar, there's a forte written there. And on the version that you see in that was published in Amsterdam, you see that there's a 6 bar of rest. How do we make out of this information? Why did we write 6 bar of rest there? So does it mean that we have to play everything out here, or are we listening to any specific things here? Again, those are unanswered questions. The first 6 bars only when the first violin, the second, the viola, the first 2 violins and the viola plays, and not any cello in there. So maybe he wants us to listen to the cello part. Maybe he wants us to listen to the bass part. Again, no figures is written in here. Again, it's very hard to answer all of this question. And finally, now we come to another example by Mozart. Now this is his piano concerto number 12 in A major, and it's in his holographic manuscript. You will see that the word col basso is there in the piano part. He wrote out only the first bar, and then the second bar he just write, just plays with the bass. And there are specific figures written in there. And this is one of the 3 concertos that Mozart actually published in his life. And this is the piano solo part in the published version in 1785. You see that all the figure-based notation stays there. Nothing is written on the right hand, though. So does it mean that he wanted us to realize all of these figure-based, or what should we do? So all of those information strongly leans toward that maybe we should play all of this, but again, there's no real concrete evidence for all of this. So I would just assume that maybe if Mozart actually wrote them in his manuscript and in the published version, so let's say maybe we should play them. But how come up until the 1830s, the tradition of playing figure-based changed, and Shirley said that you shouldn't play anymore. So I think there are some reasons behind the changes. So first of all is the rise of the new class, which they call the amateur musician. Amateur musician just means that they are music lovers. It's not that they cannot play. It's just that they learn to play music later in their life. And before, in the 18th century, music was a profession that you would actually have to learn from a master in order to be a complete musician. But throughout the time, as the history progressed, there are more and more people who are wealthy enough to be able to hire this professional musician to train them, and that's how we call the amateur musicians. Also, there's the development of printing, which means that music became more accessible. You don't have to copy from the manuscript from scratch, but you can just print it and then you can sell it as a way to make more money. And also that goes together with the shift in the music market and the fashion age. Up until the end of the 18th century, the patron of the musicians were mostly the big courts in Europe. Right? You would go and work with a court, and then Mozart tried to apply for a lot of court positions. He worked in the court of Salzburg for a while, and then near the end of his life, he worked in the court of Vienna. But then towards the end of the century, you have the dynamic kind of shift where you have certain lesser court or individuals who are wealthy enough to just commission you. For example, the case of Beethoven, where there was one prince, I forgot the name. The name suddenly slipped my mind. But then, Beethoven was sponsored individually by many people. Also, because of the French Revolution, the aristocrat class, they kind of slowly die out, which gives rise to a more wealthy merchant, or not merchant, but a different class other than aristocrat. And also, there's the development of the instrument and the modern orchestra, because this was in the time where you not only you have the harpsichord, but you have also the clavichord, you have the earlier version of the forte piano. So all of those instruments, they kind of coexist together at the time. And with the development of the forte piano, and also there are other development in other instruments, the idea of the modern orchestra slowly came into reality. Back in the middle of the 18th century, the harpsichord would play an integral part in any kind of orchestra as the bass section. But slowly, with the addition of more strings and then more woodwind instruments, and the keyboard instrument slowly fell out of favor, because at some point people argued that you wouldn't be able to hear the keyboard anymore, especially if you play on the pianoforte. If you play on a harpsichord, the penetrating sound of the harpsichord would still cut through the orchestra. But slowly, by the beginning of the 19th century, keyboard was not an integral part of the orchestra anymore. So now, this is two examples after the beginning of the 19th century. This is a concerto by Hummel, who was a contemporary composer of Mozart and Beethoven. This was published in Leipzig in 1821, and he wrote this one 3 years ago in 1818. You see that there's some notes that are larger than others in the basso, on the repertoire, and then there are also figures written in there. which strongly suggests that we should play them, or he would have wanted us to play them. And these were the first editions, which means that the composer had a certain authority together with the publisher. So this was published during the composer's lifetime, and the composer knew about this publication. A lot of Mozart's pieces were published after he posthumously after he died. Another example by Ferdinand Ries, who was Beethoven's secretary for a while, and one of Beethoven's friends, and within his close circle. This was written as late as published as late as 1834. Now there's the tutti part for 5 bars, and then the notes are enlarged with the word pad in there, which means that you're supposed to use the pedal in there. So again, we don't really have any evidence on how these pieces were premiered or were performed, because there's no way we can listen to those composers performing the piece and then we say, okay, exactly, he played that. We don't know. So these are just evidence that I gathered, and which strongly suggested that they were actually playing that, and even Czerny said that in his book, that at some point the tradition was still there for keyboard players to play together with the orchestra. So those are just the first question of performance practice: do we play those or not? And then, of course, there are other aspects of performance practice for the pieces written at that time. What about the cadenza, or what about the improvisation part there? When composer published those pieces, the cadenza part were often left open with nothing there. The composer did not really supply the cadenza section. Let's take the D minor concerto, for example. Mozart performed it. Mozart premiered that piece as part of his subscription concert, where he was showcasing his skills for the Viennese audience. And the version that modern pianists play nowadays, mostly they play the cadenza that was written out by Beethoven. And Mozart didn't really write any cadenza for this one, or maybe he wrote it and then it was lost. But there are also records of Mozart just performing or improvising like all the time when he premiered the piece. Again, those pieces were written in a very relatively short amount of time, like a few months apart from each other. So there might be reasons where Mozart didn't have enough time to just write out everything, and then he trusts his performance skill as a great keyboard player, and then he just performed whatever was on his mind at that time. Beethoven did the same thing when he first came to Vienna. He did not establish himself as a composer, but he established himself as a great performer and improviser. There are stories of Beethoven winning improvisation duels with different pianists that were visiting town. And in Beethoven's second piano concerto, he supplied the piano part late to the publisher, and he said that he didn't have enough time to write it down, and he premiered the piece even before he published it. So it means that he was just improvising, or he was just playing everything from his mind all the time. So we don't really know, did he play what he wrote there, or did he play something else every time? So in this kind of situation, we kind of turn into text editions. So text edition is very common, is a very important part of our life right now as performers, because they are considered definitive editions. They contain critical notes and important preface. They went through extensive research by musicologists, and they trusted the musician, and they are the closest reconstruction of the composer's intention. A lot of the text edition, in order to create a text edition, musicologists have to go through all the primary sources, the manuscript, the first publication, and then like to compare all of them painstakingly, and in order to put down together a version that has all the composer's original marking, dynamic, tempo marking. So it's the closest reconstruction of the composer's intention. But oftentimes, even in the Urtext edition, they don't really address the question of performance practice. Because there's no way to address the question of performance practice because we don't really know. We don't hear it, and then we can just hear it from different sources. And maybe different places have different performance practice tradition. So right now, for Beethoven or for Mozart, the two biggest Urtext editions are the one by Handel and the one by Bärenreiter. For Mozart, they kind of agree on, they kind of on the same page, whereas you see the bass line in Mozart Concerto for the solo piano part were written out. They didn't really provide any explanation for that. The same thing for Bärenreiter. When you come to Beethoven, it becomes a more heated argument. So this is the version for his Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 5 in E flat major by Handel. Nothing is written in the solo part, and the editors, they argued that when Beethoven in the manuscript of the fifth concerto, Beethoven was actually teaching his student Archduke Rudolf about the piece, and he wanted him to be the one to premiere the piece because at that time Beethoven's hearing was declining. So then he wrote the figure bass in as educational harmony exercise for Archduke Rudolf. And they compared the different marking and they compared the different ink, different pencil marking that Beethoven put it, compared the timeline that he put it in to make the argument, which was a very strong argument. And they concluded that you were not supposed to play this. And now this is the edition by Bärenreiter, which was published in 2013. The version by Handel was published in the 1990s. So, in Bärenreiter, you see that the tutti, the piano part, has a note and then the figure. And here, in the middle part, the Beethoven wrote out all the figures. It's one of the rare instances that you see all the figure bass marking very clearly in Beethoven's manuscript. And they consulted, and they came up with a different idea. They consulted. They lean more towards the historical performance practice pathway, and finally they concluded that Beethoven could have actually played this, or Beethoven's contemporaries could have actually played all of the bass part in the performance. Again, no conclusive evidence. It's just that they lean toward that idea, and it's still a heated argument between modern editions. So how do we approach this work finally? So I think in order to approach this work in a historically informed way, we have to acknowledge that this stylistic debate exists and they both have valid arguments. For example, the concerto is a device for the player to showcase the contrast between the soloist and the orchestra, and modern musicologists also argue towards this idea that if you play during the bass, it minimizes the contrast between the two forces in piano concerto, which reduce the dramatic effect of it. But then again, with all of this empirical evidence, you see that we don't really have any conclusive evidence for that. So next, in addition to playing musically, I think every keyboardist should learn to improvise and to realize figure bass as a tool. I think it's a very useful tool to learn harmonization or to explore your creativity, because all of these composers they were both composers and performers. And figure bass and improvisation is a very practical way for performers to lean into the composing process. And then we also need to consult musicological research beyond a text edition. A lot of these arguments are published in different journals or different books, and then they argue with their. Sometimes this information made it into the text, sometimes they are not. And then finally, after you have done all of this, then you decide for interpretation based on all of this information. Now, when it comes to improvisation, is something that modern pianists really rarely talk about it, because I mean, the art of improvisation for modern pianists has become a lost art. Some could do it very well, and some don't know how to start. And this is the last part of the journey is the pianoforte school, Opus 500. He put the improvisation part near at the very end of the book, and he said that also it is not only allowed, it is even considered as an ornament and an additional charm in extemporizing when the player at the proper moment interweaves foreign ideas and melodies and develop them in any manner which is usual in music. For this purpose, he must choose such known melodies and enjoy the favor of the public. So then, improvisation was actually a part of the concert pianist life in the early 19th centuries, or even in the or late 19th centuries. Examples including Liszt, who was known to have improvised all the time during his performance. And this is the 5 qualities that Cherny listed in order for you to become an adaptable and improviser. First, he said you need to master all the keys of the instrument in all the 24 keys. So you need a very good technical beginning, extensive musical reading and knowledge of the works of all the great composers. You need to know the works by the great composer and your contemporaries, a good musical memory and presence of mind, and then a thorough practical knowledge of harmony, which means that you have to be able to do that on the spot. And I think figure bass is a great way to achieve that, because you, when you realize figure bass, you're actually doing actual harmonization. And also, the art of improvisation exists in the organ world, but for the pianist, we don't really discuss that because it's hard. I have to say it's hard. And finally, a natural disposition for musical improvisation or extemporizing, which means that it's an impulse for you to go. And how are we doing on time?
It's about 1 minute, I think.
1 minute. So I have 3 examples that I want to show here. So because I don't think we have enough time to show all the 3 examples, I would just say the one on the top right is Robert Levin playing the D minor concerto. He played on the forte piano. He included a lot of ornaments, and he produced his own cadenza. The lower one here is Sir Andrashif playing the same concerto. He realized the continuo part on the keyboard, on the piano. He provided his own cadenzas, and he also conducted at the same time. And the one on the top left is a pianist, Gabriela Montero, improvising on the theme chosen by the audience on the spot. So which video do you want to see? Number 2, Robert Levin. Okay. And that takes about like 1 minute. You can hear that the piano part also plays the bass. And this is his own cadenza.
Mm-hmm.
Many harpsichord concertos by Bach thus have a melodic complement with entire tutti written
Yes.
in the hologram.
Yes.
For example, BWV 1052, 1053.
Yes, he wrote out all.
Etc.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that? Now, in the classical period, in Mozart's violin concertos,
Mm-hmm.
he would instruct the violin solos to follow the violino digitale.
Yes.
Meaning
To play
he
together.
would ask to suggest
Mm-hmm.
the solos to play along with the orchestra. So
Yeah.
what's your take on the evidence?
Yes. I think at that time, I mean, all the written evidence strongly suggests that you should do that. But I think right now, what we have in the 21st century is a result of the aesthetic of the Romantic period. For example, even in Mendelssohn's Concerto, in his manuscript, he left out a lot of the tuttis in the violin part, but then near the end, that tutti has a slur to go into the solo part, which strongly specified that the violin principal was actually playing together with the orchestra. The same thing for a lot of Mozart's violin concertos. I think again this is a result of the aesthetic of the romantic era, where you specify, where you emphasize on the contrast between the different instruments and the contrast between the solo and the tutti. I don't have any concrete answer as to why that happened or when that happened, but that's what I propose. Yeah. But I would say that the composer would actually wanted you to play together, the soloists to play together, as the genre of the concerto evolved from the concerto grosso, where you see two different parts like the concertino and the ripieno, they play together, and then it's a dialogue between them. Thank you.